Alexander the Great, Ulrich Wilken, preface by Eugene and Borza. Editor's Preface. This volume is an unaltered reprint of Wilken's work in the translation of G.C. Richards. The editor regards seriously his obligation not to rewrite Wilken, not even to engage in extended argument on disputed points. From time to time, however, it has been thought best to comment on Wilken's narrative in places where either new information or new techniques have substantially altered our interpretations. Wilken would certainly take these into account were he preparing a second edition himself, or where a number of alternative views of some importance exist and are cited for the convenience of the reader who wishes to pursue them. It is not the editor's intention to call into question every point in Alexander's life which has been the subject of disagreement. A full commentary of this sort would make the volume too cumbersome and probably deny Wilken's Alexander the wider audience it deserves. The purpose of this edition is to appeal to two main groups of readers: the general reader, an undergraduate for whom Wilken may serve as a worthy introduction to Alexander the Great, and the advanced student who must welcome the return to print of such a classic, and may appreciate the attempt to complement it with some notes on recent studies. It is hoped that students will find the editor's introduction on the background of Alexander's studies of aid and interest in determining Wilken's place in modern scholarship, and that others will find useful the collection of notes and bibliographical entries. Although no attempt has been made to make these complete, sources have been cited from time to time in the hopes that the reader will turn to the pages of these ancient authors to read of Alexander's exploits, for only in the sources can the real nature of the evidence be seen. A number of small errors, some pointed out by the original reviewers, have also been corrected in the notes. One can read Wilken through without reference to the notes and still observe what is perhaps the most balanced characterization of Alexander yet to appear. Wilken's interpretation, however, is only one among many. We may argue about interpretation so long as we recognize that a variety of views can be justified, if they are based on an intelligent analysis of the evidence. There are other interpretations of Alexander which are as legitimate as Wilken's. Each lends some new dimension to Alexander's character, which enables the student to come to a closer understanding of what was probably a very complex man. Wilken's Alexander still stands on its original merits, the last 35 years of scholarship not having produced serious doubts about the value of his portrait. The editor wishes to thank his friend and colleague, Professor Anthony J. Podlecki, for his helpful comments on the introduction, and the editors of W. Norton and Company for their service in bringing Wilken back into print. E.N.B. An Introduction to Alexander's Studies. In Search of Alexander. Ever since he emerged from a somewhat backward Macedonian nation to claim much of Greece and Asia as his own, Alexander the Great has exercised a secure hold on the human imagination. The nature of this attraction is a complex phenomenon. It is enough to say that there are many Alexanders, perhaps as many as there are those who profess a serious interest in him. The multifarious nature of Alexander requires a brief inquiry into a dilemma, in which the modern student frequently finds himself. One soon comes to recognize that he is really dealing with three Alexanders, or, rather, Alexander on three sometimes distinct, sometimes not clearly separable planes. The first of these is the mythological romantic Alexander. He is an Alexander who is said to appear in the literature of 80 nations ranging from the British Isles to the Malay Peninsula. He is a hero in many religious and secular forms in European medieval romance, a quasi-holy man in Talmudic literature, a saint in the Coptic Church of Egypt, and a new Achilles in Greek tradition. His Persian name, Iskander, still evokes quick and strange reactions in some of the people who inhabit the desolate region stretching from the Caspian to the headwaters of the Indus. The bitter memory of Alexander as conqueror is occasionally still so strong in local folklore that at least one recent Western traveler attempting to follow his track across Asia was abused with scorn by certain Afghan villagers merely because he had asked if Alexander had passed that way. According to the many legends, he was a king, a hero, a god, a conqueror, a philosopher, a scientist, a prophet, a statesman, and a visionary whose ideals of universal brotherhood are said to have laid the basis for Stoic thought. and predated Christianity by 3 centuries. He was also a drunkard, a parricide, a thief, and a butcher. He has been accused of depravities base enough to offend the sensibilities of all the ages. In short, he is a giant in literature and folk tradition, and his name and exploits, fanciful or true, are probably more widely known than those of anyone until modern times. The second Alexander is the historical Alexander. We know that with his father, Philip of Macedon, he subdued and organized the quarrelsome lot of Greek cities now past the prime of their golden age. Succeeding Philip, he crossed from Europe to Asia, and on the field of battle brought to an end the ancient but tottering majesty of the Persian Empire. Having fulfilled his role as the leader of a holy war against the traditional enemy, Alexander took an army to the Indus, the edge of the known world, and returned to expire in Babylon in his 33rd year. Of this incredible expedition we know only the bare outlines, with an imperfect chronology. That he changed a part of the world through which he marched is certain, having laid the basis for the eventual introduction of Greek civilization to a vast area of Western Asia. This process of Hellenization resulted partly in the development of institutions which produced, among other things, Roman harmony and the Christian religion. His legacy includes that important and fascinating city in Egypt, which still bears his name, as well as some 20 other Alexandrias, most crumbled beyond recognition across Central Asia. The descendants of his soldiers may have influenced the anthropomorphic form which Buddha eventually took, and in certain remote valleys of the Karakoram, there are men living today who appear to be Caucasians, speak Indo-Aryan languages, and trace their ancestry to Alexander's army. He ranks historically among the most important men who ever lived purely on the basis of his accomplishments and the change which he wrought on the history of that part of the world. The third Alexander is Alexander the Man. What makes an understanding of the real man difficult is the constant conflict between the mythological and historical figures. For Alexander became a legend virtually in his own era, and that legend, extended and corrupted throughout antiquity, has made him an enigma, affecting as it did every piece of serious or foolish writing about him. Thus each man who approaches the study of Alexander is confronted with the mythological and historical figures. What he makes out of these is for him the real Alexander, an interpretation which becomes personal. The problems confronting the biographer of Alexander, although not unique, are nevertheless compounded by the poor state of the evidence. The biographer of Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt is faced with a superabundance of material that makes impossible a truly comprehensive study of all the evidence. He must, therefore, employ screening devices which will enable him somehow to reduce great quantities of data to what is useful and germane. The interpretation which results will depend not only upon how the writer reads the evidence he has selected, but also upon the condition of the initial selection itself, the standards of relevance and priority which the writer attaches to data. In the case of the ancients, however, there can be no such arbitrary selection of evidence. Time and tide have performed the initial screening, and the few data which remain must be read in their entirety. The startling dissimilar portraits of Alexander, which issue from modern historians, can be distributed at least as much to the psychological predilections of the scholar as to the state of the evidence itself. Ulrich Wilken clearly recognized that the problem was personal. In his preface, where he suggests that every student has an Alexander of his own, one of the most perceptive scholars working on Alexander in recent years put the case more strongly when he wrote, "We all interpret the great drama of Alexander in terms of our experience and our dreams." This recalls what Theodore Mommsen once wrote in an only slightly different context. Those who have lived through historical events, as I have, begin to see that history is neither written nor made without love or hate. Modern studies. It may be said that modern Alexander scholarship began in 1833 with the initial publication of a biography by Johann Gustav Droysen. Droysen was a product of a 19th century school of German historiography, which had developed the principles of modern critical historical method. But more important, Droysen was deeply moved by the historical events of his own era. He saw Prussia emerge as a powerful German state, and throughout his life he pressed for the unification of the German peoples under Prussian leadership. Droysen was especially optimistic in 1848, and entering politics in an era in which historians were not reluctant to participate in making history. He became a member of parliament. His hopes for German unity were soon crushed, and, except for another brief return to the political arena in 1859, he spent the remaining years of his life in retirement, reworking his material on ancient history and writing vigorously on Prussia and German unity. In the light of his own historical experience and political orientation as a Prussian nationalist and fervent monarchist, Droysen's conception of Alexander should come as no surprise. The intricate problems of the Greek city-states in the classical period, with their almost constant strife and internecine conflicts, were of little interest to Droysen. The Greeks had managed to keep the Persian menace away from the Greek mainland, but just barely, and had not yet begun to fulfill what Droysen later conceived as their historical mission. Eventually, however, Philip of Macedon appeared. For Droysen, Philip is the great unifier of Greece, and his son, Alexander, the agent of the diffusion of Greek civilization. Alexander is the world figure, the historical hero who ended one era and began a new and more glorious one. Here, the nation and the great national leader emerge as dominant historical themes. The roles of Philip and Alexander as unifier and innovator, respectively, reflect Droysen's own experience in mid-19th century Germany. Moreover, it was Droysen who vigorously expounded the notion of Hellenism, that is, the fusion of Greek and Oriental cultures which Alexander wrought and which influenced the course of Mediterranean civilization throughout the rest of antiquity. Droysen's conceptions were propounded so forcefully that they have conditioned virtually all subsequent scholarship on the subject. For most of Droysen's successors, Alexander remained a world mover, although opinions have varied widely on his personal motives and the exact extent of his achievement. Serious biographical investigations of Alexander were not a pronounced feature of classical studies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This period saw the introduction of increasingly sophisticated techniques of historical study, and especially the development of a number of ancillary disciplines such as papyrology, paleography, numismatics, and epigraphy. It was, moreover, a period of clarifying and cataloging various kinds of evidence. Tens of thousands of inscriptions were collected, edited, and published. The texts of most well-known Greek and Latin writers were revised according to the latest physiographical and paleographical techniques. Great lexicons of the ancient languages were produced, and monumental encyclopedias and bibliographical surveys were assembled. The British and German universities, where the spirit of classical studies was strong, managed to authenticate and organize a valuable mass of detail, and to provide scholarship with the tools by which a deeper understanding of antiquity was now possible. In 1926, Helmut Berf published his Das Alexanderreich auf prospographischer Grundlage. The German tradition of careful classification bore fruit in this valuable work, in which all references to proper names in the ancient sources on Alexander were collected and arranged in encyclopedic form. Thus, in order to secure information about Alexander's comrade, Hephaestion, for example, one only need turn to Hephaestion's name and birth, and read the entry which includes citations to all the sources and critical commentary on the nature of the evidence. Then, in 1927, there appeared the first of the volumes in the series Die Fragmente der Griechischen Historiker, edited by F. Jacobi, which presented newly edited text and commentary on hundreds of fragments of lost Alexander historians. As a result of this tremendous burst of activity, there was now available a large body of well-organized and documented material for fresh studies of Alexander. 20th century Alexander biography took a new turn, with the appearance of the 6th volume of the Cambridge Ancient History, in which W. W. Tarn contributed an extensive account of the young Macedonian monarch. Tarn, who remains the great Hellenistic historian of this century, had produced some short studies on Alexander earlier, in which he developed ideas that were destined to make his Alexander the most debated, if not the most famous, of the modern era. In effect, Tarn took the basic Droysen conception of Alexander as world mover and added to it the dimension of a new social philosophy. Aristotle had taught that Greeks were fit to rule and aliens only to be ruled. But when Alexander prayed for a union of hearts and a joint commonwealth of Macedonians and Persians, he proclaimed for the first time, Through a brotherhood of peoples, the brotherhood of man, Alexander inspired Zeno's vision of a world in which all men should be members one of another, citizens of one state, without distinction of race or institutions, subject only to and in harmony with the common law immanent in the universe, and united in one social life, not by compulsion, but only by their own willing consent, or, as he put it, by love. When Tarn's critics attacked his Alexander as being too idealistic, he replied in a paper that Alexander was indeed the first to contemplate the unity of mankind. He described this unity, using the Greek term homonoia, as one of the great revolutions in human thought. Tarn was a lawyer by training, and the extraordinary attention he paid to evidence in order to support his case shows an acute mind at work. Poor health forced him to retire from the bar in 1905, and he was thus enabled to devote the rest of his life to historical pursuits. Tarn was a man of some means, and did not find it necessary to seek a university position as a means of support. Ensconced on his Scottish estate, with occasional trips to London to gather material, he lived the good life of the British upper class. One critic has referred to the gentlemanly and sporting Alexander of Tarn, credited with the extreme views towards life and death and honor, and temperance and love and wine which are associated with the English gentry. Tarn's idealistic Alexander became the dominant portrait. Beside it, Wilken's more reasonable and accurate, though perhaps less interesting, conception paled to all but the more serious students of the subject. Partly in response to the criticism leveled at him, and surely in defense of a commitment to his hero, Tarn published in 1948 his Alexander the Great in 2 volumes. The first volume is a short biography of Alexander, substantially a little revised version of his earlier chapters in the Cambridge Ancient History, in which the main these about Alexander's motives and conceptions were stated with great vigor. Volume 2, subtitled Sources and Studies, is an inspired and highly technical series of studies on the main problems in Alexander's scholarship, as well as a detailed consideration of the source problem. Whatever disagreements scholars were later to have with Tarn's views and conclusions, it is generally agreed that this single work marks a large step forward in the progress of modern Alexander scholarship, manifesting as it does the careful work and erudition with which the author built his portrait. In reaction to Tarn's idealizing portrait, A.R. Byrne cast Alexander in a different mold: an excellent general, a powerful ruler, a forceful personality. Byrne's Alexander nonetheless made rather little impact outside the Greco-Roman world. His empire collapsed, and even the mythology surrounding his personality, which eventually came to form such a wide-ranging tradition in Asian folklore, was really only the product of the classical romance of Pseudo-Callisthenes. For Byrne, Alexander's only real achievement was in extending Greek influence into the East, but this put a strain on Hellenism, which eventually exhausted it and prevented the Greeks from ever marshalling enough strength to ward off Roman domination. Perhaps no modern writer has argued so strongly against the standard interpretation of Alexander as a historical hero. In 1949, F. Schaffer-Meyer published his Alexander the Grossi, Ingenium Unmacht, and introduced an Alexander who, according to one reviewer, was a conception which would have been impossible before Hitler and World War II. Schaffer-Meyer's Alexander was a brilliant, though ruthless, man of ambition who found the framework of Macedon too restrictive, and so set out to expand his personal world as well as his kingdom. Possessed of an awesome ego and a seemingly limitless capacity to act decisively, this Alexander successfully threw off the strictures of the Macedonian feudal nobility and emerged in Asia as a titan of the first rank. Ruthless, forceful, and mystical, he destroyed an old order and established a new world state, centered on his own personality, behaving like a young Nazi let loose in the Alps. He showed himself capable of dreaming the dream of world conquest and achieving it. Such is Schaffer-Meyer's conception, conditional in part of a tradition begun by Droysen, but certainly more recently intensified by the author's own experience in Germany. Schaffer-Meyer finally pleads that the world has seen enough titans, let us be spared another. In recent years, the work of Ernst Badian has contributed much to our understanding of Alexander, by bringing to bear upon the work of Tarn and others a most perceptive kind of criticism. Badian has taken a portion of Schaschermeyer's view that Alexander was seeking horizons larger than the kingdom of Macedon, raised to the throne by nobles who expected to rule through him. Alexander soon recognized that he had to assert his independence from the various Macedonian factions for whom he was a puppet. As success piled upon success on the battlefields of Asia, Alexander began to replace the older Macedonians with his own men. He purged others from the court, and in doing so emerged as a king in his own right. The price he paid for his freedom, however, was a barrier erected between himself and his European traditions, for as Alexander dissociated himself from his background, he began to assume many of the trappings of an Oriental despot. He was never able to return from the summit of power, which was also a peak of loneliness. Badian has not produced a full biographical treatment. One eagerly hopes that he will. But the Alexander who has begun to emerge from a series of technical and popular articles is a man who reaches the pinnacle of success only to find himself alone, cut off from his own traditions, and made ruthless by insecurity. Badian's Alexander is essentially a pragmatist, unpossessed of the philosophical worldview attributed to him by Tarn, but perfectly willing from time to time to exploit any convenient myth to reach his own. This is an immoral Alexander, concerned almost entirely with the struggle to secure his position as absolute ruler. In the course of achieving this end, and abetted by his own enormous talents, he ended one era and began another. It is still the picture of the world mover, albeit one whose motives are intimately connected with his own ambition and design for survival. Georgius Radet produced a mystical Alexander, convinced of his own divine origin, seeking his apotheosis in India, and acted out the Iliad. Radet's fascinating story is a modern romance, set in a religious and political framework, but it adds a dimension to Alexander's character, which is attractive to the modern reader, and which helps explain the charismatic hold the subject has always maintained on the audience. C. A. Robinson, Jr., following in the tradition of Tarn, accepted the idea of Alexander's dream of the brotherhood of man. Robinson's portrait tends to cast Alexander in a favorable light, and avoids many of the traditions hostile to the king. And there are other Alexanders. A survey of the literature indicates that since Wilken's biography, 1931, alone, there have appeared over 50 serious biographical studies, 24 works of fiction, including novels, poetry, and drama, and a number of translations and critical essays on older epics. There can be no question of the popularity of Alexander continuing unabated in the modern period. Ulrich Wilken. Ulrich Emil Elias Friedrich Wilhelm Wilken was born at Stettin, now Scheißen, on December 18, 1862. Wilken began his formal training at Tübingen, moved to Leipzig, where he studied Egyptology and Assyriology, and came ultimately to Berlin to work with Theodor Mommsen. A dissertation on the history of Roman Egypt enabled the young scholar to qualify as an assistant in Egyptian studies at the Berlin Museum, where by 1883 he was put in charge of a modest collection of papyrus documents. During the next 3 decades, Wilken taught successfully at Breslau, where he was made university professor in 1891, Würzburg, Halle, Leipzig, Bonn, and Munich, before returning to Berlin as the successor to Otto Hirschfeld. In 1921, Wilken became a member of the German Academy at Berlin. It was during this initial phase of his scholarly career that he established himself as one of the founders of papyrology, the sands of Egypt having only recently yielded up a number of precious papyrus documents. Papyrology was still a fledgling in the closing decades of the 19th century. Wilken traveled throughout Europe examining papyrus collections. Utilizing his excellent background in both Egyptian and classical studies, he became a self-taught expert of the first rank. Many years later, in recognition of his pioneering work in this exacting discipline, the International Fraternity of Scholars hailed him on his 17th birthday as the Princeps Papyrologum. Wilken's interest expanded rapidly. In 1899, he published 2 volumes on Greek ostraka in Egypt and Nubia, a work which was immediately recognized as an important essay in economic history. Very early, this brilliant German had recognized that the study of papyri or ostraka was not an end in itself, but rather a means to a clearer understanding of the larger historical scene. he became more involved in the study of Hellenistic Egypt and in 1917 and 1921 published materials on Alexander, the Hellenistic economic system, and Ptolemaic mercantilism. Wilken's economic views will be apparent to the reader of Alexander the Great. The last chapter, especially, gives to Alexander and his successors, probably, the broadest economic orientation yet attempted. Wilken was among that group of European historians who saw the importance of applying the new intellectual disciplines to the study of history. In 1924, Wilken produced his Griechische Geschichte in Rahmen der Alten Geschichte, a textbook for students and teachers which has appeared in its 8th edition as late as 1958. The 1930s were for Wilken a particularly productive period. History, pepperology, legal studies, paleography, and epigraphy all came into his province. It was during this decade that Alexander the Grossi appeared along with a number of shorter studies on the Macedonian king. The Second World War curbed Wilken's activities as it did the efforts of many European scholars. We are told that the political events of that era angered and saddened him. Soon after celebrating his 18th birthday in 1942, Wilken left Berlin because of failing health and the increasingly added severity of Allied air raids. On December 10, 1944, he died in Baden-Baden. Alexander the Grossi was published in Leipzig in 1931, and within 2 years saw its English and French translations. Its reception was immediate and enthusiastic. Reviews of the time heralded it as an amazingly complete and accurate picture, the best biography of Alexander to date, and a masterpiece of historical interpretation. There were some unfavorable comments from reviewers who noted errors in minor details or objected to the skippy notes, a just criticism for serious students of the subject, or disagreed with particular interpretations of Alexander's personality and plans. To suggest here exactly what Wilken's Alexander is would anticipate his own narrative. Let it suffice to mention that Wilken continued in the tradition established by Droysen. Wilken's Alexander is an important historical figure. He does not, however, possess all of the idealism which Tarn attributed to him. For Wilken, Alexander is essentially unmotivated by any large preconceived plan, but is one who, in most cases, reacts rationally to those historical circumstances, which in time placed him in a position of great power. The source problem. Our literary evidence for Alexander's life is scanty, resting almost entirely on 5 biographical or historical accounts plus 1 romance surviving from antiquity. In chronological order, these writers are Diodorus, a Sicilian Greek of the mid-1st century BC, who composed a universal history in 40 books, 15 of which survive, and one of which, Book 17, deals entirely with Alexander. Quintus Curtius was a Latin author of the mid-1st century AD, whose only known work was a history of Alexander in 10 books, most of which survive. Possibly the most famous of the ancient writers on Alexander was the moral essayist and biographer, Plutarch, whose Life of Alexander was composed early in the 2nd century. Also dating from the 2nd century is an abbreviated account of Alexander, the works of Justine. Justine, however, is nothing more than an epitome of an earlier general history by Pompeius Trogus. It is unfortunate that Trogus is lost, for Justine must be a poor reflection of the original. Finally, there survives in complete form the Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian, written about the middle of the 2nd century. The most complete and reliable account we possess. One should note also a version of the popular romance of Alexander, which has come down to us in its early 4th century form. While interesting as a reflection of the classical romantic tradition about Alexander, little of the romance can be considered as serious history. It should be noted that the earliest of our surviving accounts, that of Diodorus, was written nearly 3 centuries after Alexander's death, and the best version, Arrian, about 2 centuries later. The most immediate questions facing the modern student, therefore, relate to the sources and traditions which the surviving writers followed. The issue is complicated by the fact that most literature of the Hellenistic period is lost, including the many accounts known to have been written about Alexander in the period immediately after his death. We are, however, not entirely ignorant of the Hellenistic traditions about Alexander. Hundreds of fragments from dozens of lost Alexander historians exist in the works of later classical authors. For example, Plutarch says Charles of Mytilene relates that once during a banquet, Alexander, after drinking, gave the cup to one of his friends. The beginning of this passage shows that Plutarch had either first or second-hand knowledge of a statement of an earlier writer on Alexander, whose name was Charles, whom he quoted for a banquet story, and whose work is lost except for about 20 such fragments. Of some of these lost historians, enough fragments have survived to enable the modern scholar to construct some kind of view of the writer's work, and in some cases even criticize our surviving writers on the basis of how dependable their sources seem. Thus, a picture, a blurred one, has evolved out of our attempts to reconstruct a 3-century-long Hellenistic tradition about Alexander. We know, for example, that Alexander was a most popular figure in serious historical writings and in fiction, that he acquired the epithet the Great, that famous Romans were compared or compared themselves to him, and that his final resting place in Alexandria becomes a pilgrimage stop for famous men. Alexander's stories apparently were common and, true or not, eventually formed a body of literature only a fraction of which survives. The original account of Alexander's Asian expedition may have come from Callisthenes of Olynthus. Callisthenes bore the distinction of being the nephew of Aristotle, and may have been recommended to Alexander by his famous tutor. Callisthenes had already established himself as one of the foremost historians of 4th century Greece, and may have eagerly anticipated becoming the chronicler for the ambitious young king. The task given him by Alexander was twofold: to keep an official history of the Asian expedition, and to submit frequent accounts to be returned and published in Greece. Macedonian rule did not sit well with the Greeks, although they were perfectly willing to support Alexander in Asia, where he would be a little trouble to them. They did not really like him. So it became Callisthenes' responsibility to make Alexander more acceptable to the Greeks, to publish reports of the king's activities, which would convince the Hellenes that their ruler was not a backwoods Macedonian boor. In time, however, the relationship between the king and the historian degenerated over the issue of Alexander's adoption of certain Asiatic ceremonial customs, a feature of court life against which even the flatterer Callisthenes protested. Eventually, Callisthenes was arrested and executed. The death of Callisthenes in 327 BC may have had a profound effect on the transmission of the Alexander story. First, it brought to a halt the official accounts, both the propaganda being sent to Greece and the chronicle Callisthenes was keeping. Second, his death may have set in motion a reaction against Alexander among the members of Aristotle's school. It has been suggested that many of Aristotle's followers, which included some of the foremost writers and thinkers of the day, adopted a hostile attitude towards Alexander because of the execution of the great philosopher's student nephew. The anti-Alexander bias may have come into the accounts which survive to this day. Thus, much of the later tradition about Alexander may be based not only on the flattering accounts of Callisthenes himself, but also on this post-Callisthenian hostility. Another primary Hellenistic tradition was based on personal recollections. Alexander had failed to nominate a successor. Almost immediately after his death, the whole of the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia was caught up in a fierce war among his commanders. This struggle for succession continued for about 2 decades. By the beginning of the 3rd century BC, however, the issues had been resolved enough to bring about the division of Alexander's old empire into a number of Hellenistic kingdoms. Moreover, now that the war was over, some of the generals who had fought at Alexander's side began to write their memoirs. Generals in every age have never refrained through modesty from putting pen to paper. The most important of these accounts was that of Ptolemy. Ptolemy, who had served under Alexander, managed to establish himself on the throne of Egypt, whence he founded that race of dynasty whose rule over the land of the Nile ended 3 centuries later with the death of Cleopatra. Ptolemy's account of Alexander centered around military affairs, was generally favorable to the king, and may have been designed in part to justify the legitimacy of the author's grip on the rich prize of Egypt. Much of Ptolemy survives in the work of Arrian, our best extant source. A number of other accounts appeared about the same time, some the personal experiences of those who had accompanied Alexander, others based on hearsay reports of what had happened, and still others concerned only with exotica and filled with the magical wonders of the mysterious East. In all, there survive more than 400 fragments from nearly 30 lost writers, whose works were written between Alexander's death and our earliest account, that of Diodorus. Some of these works, as indicated, were serious history or biography. Some were concerned only with Asian marvels. Some were the products of the rhetorical schools of Alexandria. Our evaluation of the surviving sources depends in part, therefore, on what has been pieced together about the Hellenistic tradition. It is agreed that Arrian provides the most reliable ancient evidence, even though he is furthest removed, some 5 centuries, from the events themselves. Arrian ranks first because he names his sources. He makes clear from time to time the critical method which he is employing, and he does not appear to possess any excessive prejudice about his subject. Moreover, Arrian depended on sources who were contemporaries of Alexander, and presumably were in a position to know what had happened. Their proximity to the events, however, does not necessarily guarantee that they always spoke the truth, and Arrian himself exhibits an astonishing naivety by telling us in his preface, "It seems to me that Ptolemy and Aristobulus are more trustworthy in their narratives, for Aristobulus took to the field with King Alexander. Ptolemy not only also campaigned with him, but being a king himself. To speak falsely would be more shameful to him than to another. We know that kings are not only capable of lying, but that they might have more than an ordinary cause to lie, if their accounts are in part designed to justify their crowns. This is not to say that Ptolemy did speak falsehoods. As a matter of fact, his account, at least that part of it preserved at Arrian, appears to be rather straightforward, but that he, like ordinary men, was not incapable of it. Of the remaining 4 accounts, Justine may be dismissed, in Wilken's words, as a wretched excerpt on Alexander, although it may yet prove valuable in future attempts to reconstruct the history of his source. Pompeius Trogus, Plutarch's Alexander, is fascinating and complex. It is especially valuable for a reconstruction of the intrigue at the Macedonian court which led to Philip's death and the succession of Alexander. On the whole, Plutarch's narrative is favorable to Alexander, touches on romance and places, and appears to be derived from a number of sources, some of whom he names. To judge from the number of other writers he quotes, Plutarch was one of the best-read men of antiquity. No one has yet succeeded in establishing the underlying tradition of his Alexander. It may be that his ecclesiastic manner of composition makes this impossible. Diodorus presents even greater problems. Nowhere in his book on Alexander does he name a source. Although he shares much with both Plutarch and Arrian, Diodorus' account is generally colorless, frequently confused on questions of chronology and geography, and lacking in the recognition of any great theme or motive in Alexander's life beyond the role which fortune, Tyche, plays in determining the course of men's affairs. This is an author who contains much good material, but who must be used with care and common sense until more can be said about his methods and the traditions he followed. Curtius provides us with the most colorful of the surviving historical accounts. His history of Alexander is highly rhetorical, riddled with impossible speeches, and contains a well-defined, unflattering tradition. Its fullness also supplies information about a number of events hardly recorded elsewhere, although it is frequently difficult to determine what extent such matters are credible. The nature of Curtius's history is such that it has led modern critics to suspect that his main source was Clearchus, an extremely popular author who probably wrote in the early 3rd century BC, and whose flamboyant account of Alexander's exploits may have been the most widely known in the classical world. Moreover, Curtius did indeed rely heavily on Clearchus, about whom classical antiquity had a low opinion as a reliable historian. Then Curtius' account is at least suspect. Such is the state of our literary evidence for the life of Alexander. The interpretations of his career which have emerged rest mainly on this small group of sources. Alexander's biographers differ depending upon which of the sources each chooses to trust. Accept Curtius here, reject Arrian here, accept Diodorus here, reject Plutarch there, etc. Some modern writers reach the point in their investigations where a conception of Alexander became rather fixed, and they began to reject or accept evidence depending upon whether that evidence was consistent with their characterization. There is no need to point out the danger here, yet the trap is essentially sprung when the evidence is so minute and frequently confusing. Moreover, The modern student, perhaps influenced by behavioral studies, sometimes feels constrained to seek patterns of orders in Alexander's character. But why must Alexander, or any other historical figure, be marked by consistent behavior? Must there necessarily be something systematic about Alexander's actions? Might it not be true, for example, that Alexander was capable of brutality and kindness, depending upon his mood or what suited his purpose at the moment? There also might be mixed in his nature more than a little mystical and non-rational behavior, not in keeping with the normal portrait of a shrewd soldier and calculating statesman. Wilken's biography of Alexander has endured, for it recognizes the complexity of the man. It does not attempt to cast him into a particular mold. It portrays him as an individual of shifting moods and ambitions whose horizons were enlarged as success brought power and opportunity. Wilken's Alexander is no ordinary man. No one who accomplished what he did in so short a time can be ordinary. Yet for Wilken, he remains human. It was Alexander's lot that to act as a human being was to move on a vast stage, affecting the lives of countless persons in his own days, and capturing the fancies of those who lived after. Eugene and Borza. Preface. It is in no light task to write the story of Alexander's unique life in a continuous form, owing to the gaps and distortions of the traditional account. It is doubly difficult when the description is intended in the first instance for the general public of educated readers, with their different interests and varied attitudes to the ancient world. Alexander is no easy personality to grasp, since Droysen, in 1833, paved the way for future students by the brilliant work in which he made his debut. Such different conceptions of the great monarch have been put forward, that it is hardly an exaggeration to say that every student has an Alexander of his own. How comes it that after a century of zealous study, Alexander is still a problem and subject of controversy? In the first place, the fragmentary character of our tradition is to be taken into account. The dominating influence of classicism in the imperial age brought about the loss of Hellenistic prose generally, and in particular, the whole of the literary work on Alexander between his lifetime and the reign of Augustus. It is only because later writers made use of them that we can form approximate ideas of the older authors who wrote either in Alexander's lifetime or soon afterwards, such as Callisthenes, Onesicritus, Nearchus, and others, or Creacticus, who about 310 BC created the, already in part legendary, Vulgate, or Aristobulus, and Ptolemy, son of Lagus, who as king of Egypt wrote, from personal recollection and with use of Alexander's official diaries, his memoirs, which are so important in military of matters. The comprehensive narratives preserved to us start only with the age of Augustus. First we have Diodorus and Trogus Pompeius, the latter only in Justin's wretched excerpt of the 2nd century. Then comes Curtius Rufus in the reign of Vespasian, and finally Plutarch and Arrian in the 2nd century. The three first named in the main draw their information from Clearchus. We owe it to Arrian that we are so well informed about Alexander's military exploits. For these, Ptolemy was his chief authority. As soon, however, as we attempt to estimate Alexander as statesman or economist, or try to grasp his inner life and his personality as a whole, we find that we are faced by what can only be described as a heap of ruins. Secondly, in this ancient literature itself, there are diametrically opposite conceptions and estimates of Alexander. On the one hand, we have favorable, nay, panegyrical pictures; on the other, depreciatory, even hostile judgments, which represent him as a despot made degenerate by the East, or as an adventurer owing everything to luck. This twofold character of tradition has contributed to cause the wide divergences among modern writers in their treatment of the problem. The greatest difficulty of all lies in Alexander's own personality. Not only was his character very complex and contained apparently irreconcilable opposites, but there was in him a superhuman quality, and genius is never quite capable of explanations, and must remain to us miraculous. The riddle of his life cannot be solved by resort to reason alone, for alongside of a clear and sober intellect, he had in him much that was non-rational. To regard him simply as a coolly calculating politician is to overlook the romantic and mythical traits in his nature. Lastly, a judgment of his achievements is rendered more puzzling by the fact that a premature death carried him off in the middle of his creative activity. We have before us only beginnings, and in no single instance was the last word spoken. The study of history can offer no harder task than the attempt to get hold of the real personality of Alexander. No one will be presumptuous enough to imagine that he has taken his true portrait, but to approximate to it is a tempting enterprise, and one which carries with it its own reward. As it has attracted many inquirers in our own day, so it has been my pursuit from earliest youth. My object in this book is to represent the growth and development of Alexander's personality, which was in a constant process of evolution, and to show how ideas successfully sprang up and ripened in his mind. It is in this sense that I have tried to give the reader a connected narrative of his life. I have introduced it with a sketch of the age into which he was born, and added at the end a survey of the effects on future ages of his life's work. Ulrich Wilken, Berlin, January 1931.